Good evening, and welcome to What's Your Story? President Harry Truman is quoted as having remarked, "The only thing new in the world is the history that you don't know." If you love history, this show is for you. There are many great repositories of history in the United States, but did you know that right here in Connecticut is one of the best? The Connecticut Historical Society has been preserving Connecticut's history for nearly 200 years. My guest tonight, Ilene Frank, will help bring that history to life. Welcome to the show, Ilene.
Thank you for having me.
Ilene, let's get right to it. Would you please share with our viewing audience exactly what your title is?
I'm the Chief Curator and Chief Operating Officer.
Chief Curator, Chief Operating Officer. Now, what does that mean?
What does that mean? It's a big title to say that I'm the one who runs the collections, exhibitions, and education departments, as well as I oversee the state folk life program and handle marketing efforts for the Historical Society.
And I'm going to imagine that's an enormous, humongous job, right?
It's a pretty big job. Thankfully, I have some great staff and a great group of directors and who are underneath me, and we all make it happen together. So.
How many people do you have on your staff?
At the Historical Society, full and part-time, we are about 32 people on staff. Those departments that I mentioned that I oversee are, depending on how many part-time staff we have at the time, around 25 usually.
Well, we want to give the staff a shout out, right?
Absolutely.
And say thank you to the staff because they're the worker bees.
Completely.
Yeah, I understand that completely. So staff, shout out to you. Now, how long have you been employed there?
It's been almost 4 years since I started. I arrived the summer of 2015, and it feels like summer today. It's gorgeous, so yeah. Really?
In 2015 you arrived?
2015.
There? Okay. Now, what about your educational background? Please tell us about that.
Sure. So, you know, it's funny. I think when you're young, you think your life is going to be an arrow in one direction, and you realize there's more twists and turns as you get older. But somehow it all works out, so that's great. I grew up outside of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And I went to a state school, St. Mary's College of Maryland.
Were you born in the D.C. area?
I was, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was actually, I was born right in downtown D.C. at George Washington University Hospital.
Is that right?
And
did you go to high school in D.C. or no?
I grew up in Maryland. I grew up in the suburbs outside of D.C.
What high school did you go to?
I went to John F. Kennedy High School.
Oh, okay. So did that school have a mascot?
We were the Cavaliers.
The Cavaliers. I ask all my guests that.
We were the Cavaliers, yeah.
One other question that's not here that may trip you up. When you graduated, what was your prom song, the theme prom song? Do you remember?
It was You Look Wonderful Tonight, but I did not go to my prom.
Oh.
Which is not, my friends and I decided to skip prom, and we went to the Hard Rock Cafe in D.C. instead. So no hurt feelings, but I believe the theme was You Look Wonderful Tonight.
Eric Clapton.
Yeah.
You Look Wonderful Tonight.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I can't believe I remembered that.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Right.
That's why you ask people and you get it going on.
Sure.
So what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like that? Come on, talk to the audience tonight.
I grew up loving history. I had a great family and a mom who encouraged my love of history and for education. And so my career path, my undergraduate work and then my graduate work at the Cooperstown graduate program, and then leading to this job is really, I get to do amazing things. I get to combine studying about history and learning about history with sharing that information with others and hopefully inspiring them to pay attention to what's happened so that they can maybe figure out what they can do today or tomorrow.
Now, perhaps I missed it, but is your degree in history your undergrad degree?
Yeah, my bachelor's is in history and my master's is in museum studies.
Museum studies. And museum studies, I didn't hear of that when I was in college.
Yeah,
but of course they had logs in the fire when I was in college. So.
Sure, it's a newer major. The program that I went to, the Cooperstown graduate program, which is associated academically with the State University at Oneonta, of the State University of New York at Oneonta. So it's a SUNY school.
So SUNY, yes,
yep.
Okay, all right.
SUNY
yes.
Oneonta.
Yes.
And the program has been around since the 1960s. It was one of the first in the nation. Now, museum studies, public history degrees are really a blossoming field in higher education. And there are a lot of students and faculty who are looking at how you don't have to just be an academic historian to practice the field of history. So I was really fortunate to find this this path of museums.
Now, when you were doing your graduate degree, was the field predominantly male, or was it female, or was it mixed, or?
When I was getting my degree, the field was maybe skewed a little bit more male. We've become a little bit more women-dominated.
Okay.
And it's something that we're actually really looking at as a field is gender balance, and of course, are there more men in leadership position as men become maybe less of the entire workforce, but are they still getting those higher leadership jobs? So that gender balance, which I think is being examined in so many industries and academic fields, is also playing out in the museum field.
So, Ilene, if I may address you as Ilene,
Sure.
please dispel the myth for our viewing audience and the young ladies watching that women, females are not traditionally interested in history. Have you found that to be true?
I haven't. I mean, maybe I think if I have, it's that while women are interested in history, they might not be as interested in military history, and that's definitely a myth. I have a young woman on staff who loves military history. Maybe at times it was thought that women might do the family history or the genealogy, but they might not be as interested in industrial history. And I think those myths are being dispelled as we look at history as being this web of interwoven stories. You need to know a little bit of everything. You can't, even your family history, you can't just look at your family history and not understand the professions that people had or the industries in the town that were, the main businesses that your family probably worked at. So I think that's a myth we're hoping to work against.
Now, when I sat down and talked to you at the Connecticut Historical Society, you told me that your background is Jewish. Is that correct?
I am, yes.
So did you, and you had recently been to Israel, is that correct?
Yes.
And how did that shape your worldview or change what you were thinking about history, your trip to Israel? Yeah,
well, I think to start off with, being Jewish, we're a people of memory, of course. I think that could be said for a lot of religions, but memory and history play a large role in the religion and in our holidays. So that probably is just built into my DNA. My most recent trip to Israel, anytime you visit any country or any place, the places that you've read about, places that you've seen photographs, they just become so much more alive when you're walking in those places, when you're walking on the sands, when you're viewing the Judean desert, when you're visiting cities as old as Jerusalem. It just makes all of that history that can sometimes feel remote become very real and present. So I think that's definitely one of the takeaways I have from my most recent trip to Israel.
Did it change your views on how history is viewed in terms of that part of the world before you went and after you were there and actually got a chance to see it, feel it, experience, breathe it?
Sure. So Israel and the neighboring countries is an incredibly complex place.
Yes.
And I think I have an even deeper appreciation for the layers of complexity that are there and that play out from everyday things, from how civil and family court is handled in Israel, which is in a lot of ways still on religious lines, is my understanding, to just other societal issues. And so the complexity of the country became even more complex after visiting.
Is it a theocracy or?
No, it's a democracy. I mean, I think people would argue that this is out of my realm of expertise, whether it's a theocracy. I mean, it is Israel is the Jewish state.
Yeah.
It's. I can't speak with much authority to that one.
Tell us a little bit about your parents and your siblings. You got siblings? Where were your parents? Your mom, your dad? Where did they come?
So my mom was born in Washington, D.C., lived in D.C. till she was about, I think, 9, and then moved to the suburbs of Maryland. Her profession, she was a teacher and then a principal at an elementary school in Montgomery County, Maryland. She, even in retirement, continues working in the field of education. She works at the University of Maryland. She supervises students when they're doing their student teaching. So she's still very much involved in education.
Okay, all right.
My dad was also born in Washington, D.C., and lived there until he was an adult. Went to a high school in D.C., Coolidge High School. He's a lawyer, still practicing law, private practice. They separated. They both got remarried. So my sibling question is, I have have older stepsister, I have younger stepsister, stepbrother, half brother, regular brother. It's where
I understand
it's
that.
a very blended.
It's a mix, a blended
It's a very
family.
mixed, blended family. Yeah.
I have the same thing
Yeah,
going on,
yeah.
so I can identify completely.
Yeah,
with
when
what you're talking
people
about.
will say, you know, how many siblings do you have? And I'm like, oh, it's.
Let me start counting.
Let me start.
That's
Yeah.
right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I ask those questions, obviously, to give the viewing audience an overview of you and who you are and how you ended up at the Connecticut Historical Society, your background. Now that we've established that, would you please give our viewing audience an overview of the founding of the Connecticut Historical Society? And I have a series of questions here that I will go through one at a time. Why was it created?
Oh, I'll start with that one. So we are jumping way back in time to the 1820s.
Okay.
And it was created because there were a group of people, there was a group of men, white men, who really started believing in the power of history to give people a sense of pride and a sense of place, and because they were concerned that people weren't paying attention to their history. So there was this mixture of anxiety over, oh, we're going to lose historic documents, we're going to lose these stories, and also this real passion for wanting to raise up history as something that can be a source of civic pride. And so that's the why.
Okay. All right. By whom? Tell me some of the names.
Some of the names, yeah.
It may be familiar to our viewing audience, right?
Sure. So a lot of the key family names associated with Connecticut in the 1820s were involved. One of the leading advocates for the creation of the state was Reverend Thomas Robbins. He actually becomes our first librarian once we have a first paid position.
Okay.
And he had seen other historical societies. He'd been to Massachusetts. He became a member of the Antiquarian Society, and he gave a speech at least as early as 1822 advocating that Connecticut needed a state historical society.
What is an antiquarian society?
The Antiquarian Society, which still exists in Massachusetts, is a society dedicated to the study of antiquity, so the study of old papers and maps and books and objects.
All right.
And so he was really our fiercest advocate, and he was doing these sermons and these speeches about the need. And he was able to meet up with people like Judge John Trumbull, and Thomas Pitkin and Thomas Day, and eventually 31 men petitioned the Connecticut General Assembly to get a law passed that there should be a Connecticut Historical Society. And that happened in May of 1825. And so they organized, they met, they elected officers, if anyone's been involved with a not-for-profit, they wrote the Constitution, they wrote the bylaws, all that fun stuff, but you need it to run an organization. They did all of that, and they started posting advertisements in the Current announcing their meetings and announcing that they had formed. So there was this flurry of activity in 1825. They had charter members who signed up right away, including people like Thomas Gallaudet, who was
the American School for the Deaf.
American School for the Deaf founder.
Yes.
And what's interesting is when you look at Hartford in the 1820s, really even like 1817 to into the 1820s, there was this whole spirit of reform. This is the time period when the American School for the Deaf is being founded, when the Hartford Asylum for the Insane, which is now the Institute of Living, is being founded. So there's this real spirit in the community that we're prosperous enough, and we should now erect institutions that will help our community and enable civic pride. And I think the Historical Society could be all lumped into that kind of feeling.
Now, you told me an interesting story about where the Connecticut Historical Society was originally located.
Yeah.
Where was it located?
So as great as 1825 was, we went into a period of dormancy until 1839.
Okay.
There's all reasons for why it happened, but it happened. In 1839, the organization was revived. They met occasionally for a few years in a rented room near Center Church in Hartford on Main Street. And then once the Wadsworth Athenaeum was built, we had room set aside for us in the Athenaeum to be our reading room, to be the library, to be our collection storage. So that was really our first permanent home.
Your first permanent home, the Wadsworth Athenaeum.
Yeah.
Wow, that's an amazing story.
Yeah,
Wow.
and it was great. I mean, the Wadsworth, when he had the idea of building an Athenaeum, he really wanted a place where you could study art and history and science and come in and be educated. And so having the Historical Society there along with the amazing art collection that's still there was a really wonderful fit.
How long were you at the Athenaeum?
So we were there until 1950, so a little bit over 100 years.
So from 1839?
1840s is when we moved into the
So
Athenaeum.
from 1840s till 1850 you were at the
So
Athenaeum?
1950.
I mean, the 1950s
Yeah.
you were at the Athenaeum?
Yeah,
Wow.
very, very long time.
Wow, yeah, that is a very long time.
Very long time. And then in the late 40s, early 1950s, we decided, the urban myth I've heard is that we were told we were a fire hazard. We had too much paper crammed into too small of a space. So we had to find a new building. And where we're currently located at 1 Elizabeth Street in Hartford was the home of Curtis Veeder. He was an inventor. If you remember the old gas pumps that had the dial that clicked as you pumped the gas.
I remember.
He invented that measuring device. He invented that meter, as well as a bunch of other stuff. So
There was a Veeder root.
that was his company, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So in the 20s, he had built this house in the West End, Hartford's fashionable West End.
Okay, yes.
Because he was an engineer, it is over-engineered. We've had studies done, and everyone says if there's ever an earthquake in Hartford, the best place to be is in the house from the 1920s, because it's not going anywhere.
You're not going anywhere.
So by the 1950, he had passed away. His widow was living in the house. His 2 daughters didn't want the house. And so she sold it to the Connecticut Historical Society, and that became our new home.
Wow. Okay. Were women involved in the creation of the Connecticut Historical Society? If so, who?
Yeah.
Whom? And if not, why not?
So according to all the official records, no. No woman's name appear in the list of charter members. There's no women's names who appear on the
Weren't
petition.
these men married?
They were married. You would hope that the women were encouraging them at home.
Yeah, you would hope that there was at least a behind-the-scene influence there.
I mean, like,
There were some very prominent women in
absolutely.
1825 through the 1800s into the 1950s.
Right. So the poet Lydia Sigourney, her husband was involved at the beginning, but her name doesn't appear in any of the official documents, right?
Wow.
So, things like that. The first woman who was admitted as a member to the Historical Society didn't happen until the late 1800s. So for a very long time, the Historical Society was a gentleman's club. Women were not even allowed to be members. And Ellen Larned became a member. It was late 1880s or early 1890s when she was admitted. She became the first female member of the Connecticut Historical Society.
Now, looking at 2019, even though there's still struggles with males and females and so forth, it's quite astounding that women were not a part. Well, they were a part. They just weren't given the credit, I believe.
Right.
That's my personal take.
Yeah. So I think that you're absolutely correct in that just because women's names don't appear in documents,
Right.
don't think they weren't involved.
Exactly.
And you could say that by so many groups.
About so many ethnic groups.
Absolutely.
Because your name doesn't appear doesn't mean your
you
efforts weren't there.
Right. Doesn't mean that you didn't exist or you didn't play a role. But we know that historical documents are biased just by the fact of who wrote this stuff down.
Absolutely.
And who kept what.
Absolutely.
So, we have these men whose names appear in these documents, and the men who kept maybe diaries or account books that came into our collection, they skew what we know about history. And their wives could have been keeping diaries and been writing very similar things, but maybe they didn't enter into our collection. So it's always something for us to consider. Absolutely, though, the women were not sought out. Their involvement wasn't sought out the way that we would today, but that doesn't mean that they weren't involved at all.
Absolutely. That's a great segue because Connecticut has always benefited from a diverse and rich multicultural mosaic. Did the founders take advantage of this situation by including the history of those different cultures? If not, why not?
Yeah. You know, I was glad you sent me that question ahead of time so I could think about it a little bit. And the very short answer is no, that they were interested in their own history and what they thought was proper history, and that would be ancestor worship and raising up of the Anglo-Americans and the white European Americans who they believe founded Connecticut. So they were not actively seeking to collect information about the indigenous people. They weren't thinking of collecting information about African Americans who were in Connecticut from the 1600s and on. So no, their intent was not to collect a diverse history. But when we look at some of the collections that we have, and if we use from that time period, and we use a different lens to view that collection. For instance, we have one of the earliest things we collected in 1839 was a sword used in the Pequot War. Now, it was collected because it was considered to be the sword of a great white man, but we can also use that sword now to talk about the indigenous view of that item and to add on a different layer of interpretation and to raise up the voices of the people who didn't make the historic record in the same way.
Do you know if any of the founders were abolitionists or slave owners or pro-slavery?
So according to our records, we don't know for sure that any of them in the time period of their lives owned slaves. I need to do some more research into if their families were slave owners. They also weren't necessarily very vocal abolitionists. None of them came out as being strong abolitionists. That doesn't mean that they weren't abolitionists. A lot of them were Federalists, and Federalists were very
strong
much
central government.
Yeah. So they were the Standing Order of Connecticut. They were politically conservative in that time period. They were not necessarily radical abolitionists that you have who pop up in the 1840s especially.
Well, the movement was certainly around at that point in time,
and was active in Connecticut.
Absolutely, yes.
And people often forget Connecticut was a slaveholding state. We had gradual emancipation that started in the 1780s, and slavery was not abolished completely on our law books until the 1840s. It was a very, very long period. But none of these men jumped up when I was doing a little research. None of them jumped up completely as slave owners or fierce abolitionists.
As abolitionists to the cause against slavery.
Right.
Now, when you look back at that period and you see the history that they collected, right? Do you still have examples of what was collected back in the 1840s? And you still have it there in your at the society now?
We do. And so like I mentioned, that sword, so every item in our collection has an accession number. That's our inventorying system.
Okay, all right.
And our accession numbers start with the year they enter the collection. And so whenever I come across something that has an accession number, 1839, 1842, 1850, I have this moment of awe that at that point, which already today in 2019 seems so long ago, that there was somebody who thought, oh, this object, which comes from the 1700s or the 1600s, was worth saving. It was worth saving. Let's give it to the Historical Society. So it's always this little fascinating moment for me. And then we have a lot of the early diaries and account books, the things that were first collected. And as I mentioned, Thomas Robbins, who was our first librarian, his personal library became our first library. Over 4,000 volumes of books and pamphlets.
Terrific. Well, that's all the time we have for part one of this show tonight. My thanks to my guest, Irene Frank. Everybody has a story. What's yours? Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, good night.